Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Critic Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the review copy I received of Tiny Trinket Games action platformer Azuran Tales Trials. Find out if I found myself a fan of this title, or if I found it to be, at best, trial-some. When an ancient evil begins to fester in the land, the king sees fit to send out a squadron of soldiers to suppress it. Yet they find themselves slaughtered down to the last. You take the role of Marius, a battle cleric who had fallen in that conflict, and now finds himself with a new lease on life courtesy of the god of death, Trinket. Provided, of course, he agrees to help take down the ancient evil which had seen him felled in the first place. Narratively, the main storyline is provided to players in large chunks at the beginning and end of every stage. The additional bits of lore is to be found in journal pages the player can collect throughout each level, but that's the format you're generally going to be coming in contact with. Now, whilst the journal pages are technically optional, you generally have to go out of your way to avoid them, and they provide flavor about the game's world at large, and give small bits of information about the bosses you're encountering and help to further highlight the characters. And I did find that the writing added a lot to the adventure, as it helped provide a voice to Marius, painting him as a fairly sympathetic protagonist who is uncertain about his ability to measure up to the task he's been thrust into, as well as following his development. That said, while the game does try to build up a compelling world, there's some quirks in the writing that crop up. Trinket, the demise-defying death deity, is by and large the source. Whilst at times there's a degree of dry or dark humor in what he says, other times there's moments, a number of them in fact, that come off as fairly ridiculous or leaning heavily on the fourth wall right on the heels of some of the more serious moments in the game. That said, while there's nuance to its storytelling, Azuran Tales is straightforward on a mechanical level, being a stage-based action platformer with an emphasis on exploration and punishing difficulty. That said, the punishing aspect of the game is perhaps one of the key elements that had me squinting at it, if only due to the reason why. On one hand, I'm not adverse to high lethality, and Azuran Tales certainly has that in spades, given normal monsters and traps are frequently able to obliterate you in a couple of hits. And pairing this with stamina-based combat to try and emphasize a more tactical style of combat does help to hammer that point home, at least in a game where combat doesn't feel broken and janky. Let's take it from the top. So, first and foremost, the effective range of your attacks is wonky, as it's not uncommon for your attacks failing to hit the monsters even as your mace swings are literally connecting with their face. Insult to this particular injury, however, is that's if you can even finish the swing, given there's a semi-frequent issue where your swing animations reset or cancel outright in the middle of the swing. It's not a fun combination, to be frank, which might be why I ended up abusing another element of the game. Specifically, the lack of solidity that your foes have. That's right, you're more than capable of just walking right through your enemies as they wind up their attacks, and as long as they lack an AoE that hits behind them, you're free to then just try and smack them in the back with impunity. Admittedly, I did have to start dodging and blocking as I progressed for reasons which varied from things as unavoidable / slowing damaging auras in a melee-oriented game, to attacks with massive backswings. In the face of this, the traps are comparatively more forgiving, as whilst there's a few cheaply placed ones, I couldn't fault anyone but myself for the majority of my deaths through. Other than the ones placed on stairs, as your ability to jump is severely hampered, or the ones where an off-screen enemy with a projectile hook proceeds to scorpion pull you into an instant death trap. Seriously, fuck that. Also, the one that was planted just perfectly, so when you get off the ladder and automatically roll, it rolls you directly in front of the blade, so if you even make the mistake of touching the controller's direction at all, you die. Fuck that. Anyways, it actually made me really grateful that the game was fairly generous with the amount of checkpoints it scattered about, or the fact that enemies didn't respawn when you died. really, the biggest downside to dying, other than bosses healing back to full, is tied to the game's progression system. To be exact, there's 3 main ways you'll be progressing in Azuran Tales. The first one is that you'll be occasionally rewarded with equipment as you progress through the levels, which provides you with an undefined amount of extra health and damage, as well as a change to your appearance. Whilst this upgrade is mostly permanent, if you replay earlier levels, you'll actually downgrade yourself when you inevitably pick up one of the earlier chunks of equipment, as they aren't actually items that you can swap between at will. In fact, you don't ever really get to find out how much health or strength they provide, or that you even have, really. The same can't be said of the game's sigil system, however. See, as you wander through the dungeons, you'll collect sigil pieces, the likes of which become a complete sigil when you acquire 10. They're basically skill points. You can either spend these in your character sheet to provide yourself stat bonuses and gradually unlock character abilities, or you can seek out special shrines throughout the stage, which, for a greater sigil investment and some gold, provide generally chunkier stat boosts. I say generally because for some unfathomable reason, the health upgrades are completely garbage. Quite frankly, even when you're completely maxed out, you're still at risk of being 1 or 2-shotted by a number of critters and obstacles, and the upgrades for the sigils at these shrines that you spend like the health sigils on actually give you less than the upgrades you would get at your character sheet. They're just literally junky upgrades. Anyways, what's interesting about these systems is not only do they provide you a form of progression, they also provide you the only meaningful penalty to dying, as you lose half of the incomplete sigil pieces and gold you're carrying whenever you croak, and you don't get to retrieve them. Although you can at least deposit any of the ones you're carrying whenever you find a shrine. It also provides one of the primary reasons to explore the stages, given that each contains a plethora of chests rife with loot. Though, given these chests don't respawn even on replays, it once again hammers home that penalty for dying. Now, where to begin? So, first off, Azuran Tales looks fairly nice at a glance. The main character has an appearance that gradually evolves you to collect power-ups from bosses, and there's a decent environment to explore and enemies to poke at. That said, a large handful of the boss fights you'll encounter definitely fall under the normal enemy you've already fought, but larger category. There's also the whole animation issues, which I'd mentioned earlier, both in regards to them resetting, or simply being inconsistent in regards to their hitboxes. And that said, it's not just the animations of the character I take issue with. A number of the enemies you fight have their own inconsistencies, such as wielding attacks, which are unblockable or undodgeable. But here's the thing, there's nothing to telegraph that they carry these properties, so the odds are you're apt to keel over a few times as you learn this lesson. This is compounded even further by a few attacks which lack startup animations or warnings, and a few instances of projectiles which don't have any sort of visual startup and will possibly just spawn directly on top of you. On the other hand, I don't have much to complain about the game's sound design. I mean, the music's alright. There really wasn't anything I could gripe about the sound effects, other than, well, a few instances where the sounds for certain attacks or objects continue to loop themselves unnecessarily for a little while, though that was thankfully quite rare, but it happened. Anyways, this brings us to the conclusion, and I think if I could best sum up Azuran Tales, it would be an interesting bit of storytelling which is completely marred by its gameplay. And I love a good story. And it managed to do a good job of getting me invested in its lore and where it was going with the whole plot arc. And yet the further I progressed in the game and was made subject to the various failings of its system, the more my will to persevere and invest myself oozed away in a puddle of disappointment. I found myself frequently frustrated, not because of some personal failing on my part, but because the game's bugs, poorly telegraphed attacks, or just cheap, death-inducing gimmicks would shuffle me off the mortal coil. And a number of the later fights began to melt together to feeling identical, even as they began to multiply the number of boss encounters that were in a stage. Ultimately, it left a bad enough taste in my mouth that, despite the fact that the game ends on a sequel hook, and there remains a lingering curiosity about where they might take it narratively, I think I would have a lot of difficulty convincing myself to take that plunge, or even to recommend this to someone else, even if they're a fan of platformers. And it's for that reason that I ultimately rate this game as a fail. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or the description so you can become part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. And lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help just provide some supplementary funds for our lovely editor, Rand, and to make sure we continue to provide quality content. Again, you can check the description and the banner for them links. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.